The deadbolt slid home with a sound like a gavel striking a final judgment. Metal against metal, sealing the world away. We stood in the narrow hallway of the safe house, the central air conditioning humming a sterile, mechanical counterpoint to the violent rhythm of the rain lashing against the reinforced glass. Water dripped from the hem of my trench coat, pooling on the hardwood. 3 feet away, Maggie stood perfectly still. She wasn't looking at the security keypad or the steel shutters. She was looking at me. In that sudden, deafening silence, I realized the marshals had it wrong. The greatest danger to my career wasn't the assassin hunting her down. It was the woman standing in the foyer, smelling of rain and ruin. I have built my life on the architecture of the law. As a Supreme Court clerk, I live in a world of written opinions, binding precedents, and the comforting, rigid geometry of the Constitution. I believe in lines that cannot be crossed. I believe in the sanctity of the record. But standing there, watching Maggie shake the water from her hair, I felt the structural integrity of my world groan. The transfer had been a masterclass in controlled chaos. 3 armored SUVs, a phalanx of federal agents, and the strobe light panic of a high-speed extraction through DC traffic. The noise had been absolute. Sirens cutting the night, radio chatter, the heavy thud of run-flat tires on wet pavement. And then, abruptly, it was gone. The convoy peeled away into the storm, taillights dissolving into the gray downpour, leaving us stranded in this government-sanctioned purgatory. A safe house is designed to be a void. It has no history, no personality, and no soul. It is a container for human evidence, stripped of anything that might leave a mark. Maggie didn't move like evidence. She moved like a storm front that had decided to settle indoors. She dropped her bag on the floor, the heavy leather landing with a dull thud that echoed too loudly in the empty space. She turned in a slow circle, surveying the beige walls and the generic furniture with a look of aristocratic boredom. I adjusted my glasses, a nervous tic I thought I'd conquered in law school. My suit was tailored, restrictive, a uniform of the court designed to erase the body beneath it. It was armor, woven from wool and ambition. Maggie was a study in contrast. Her silk blouse was disheveled, the top button undone, revealing the damp sheen of her skin. It was expensive fabric, the kind that whispers when it moves, stained now with the gray damp of the storm. She smelled of ozone, expensive tobacco, and the specific, sharp scent of a woman who has just walked away from a burning building without looking back. "We need to establish the protocol," I said. My voice sounded thin, absorbed instantly by the acoustic tiles. "This is a secure facility, Maggie. There are blind spots in the perimeter cameras, but inside, we follow the marshal's guidelines. You stay away from the windows, we keep the lights low. You do not leave the common areas without clearing it with me." Maggie stopped pacing. She looked at me, really looked at me, with eyes that were dark, intelligent, and completely unimpressed by my badge. She didn't speak immediately. She just let the silence stretch, pulling it taut between us until I felt the urge to fidget. It was a look that dismantled my authority without a single syllable. It said she knew exactly who held the power in this room, and it wasn't the woman with the law degree. "You have a very loud mind, Luciana," she finally said. Her voice was low, textured like rough velvet. "I can hear the gears grinding from here." "I am responsible for your safety," I countered, stiffening. "That requires order." "Safety is an illusion," she murmured, walking past me toward the dark living room. "And order is just what you tell yourself to sleep at night." As she brushed past, the hallway seemed to shrink. The safe house, which had looked expansive on the blueprints, suddenly felt suffocatingly intimate. The air displaced by her movement carried that heat, a physical weight that pressed against my chest. I watched her walk into the shadows, realizing with a sinking sensation that the walls weren't there to keep the world out. They were there to keep us in. And 72 hours suddenly felt like a life sentence. The first 2 hours of confinement were an exercise in sensory deprivation. The safe house had been scrubbed of all human detritus. No photographs, no knickknacks, no stray books. It was a vacuum. And in a vacuum, every sound is amplified. The hum of the refrigerator sounded like a generator. The settling of the foundation sounded like footsteps. But the loudest thing in the house was Maggie's refusal to be still. I had claimed the dining table as my jurisdiction. It was a heavy oak slab that I fortified with the contents of my briefcase. I laid out the case files in a precise grid, red-weld folders for the prosecution, blue for the defense, and a yellow legal pad for my own frantic attempts at logic. I aligned my pens. I checked the battery on my encrypted laptop. I built a wall of jurisprudence to separate myself from the woman pacing the perimeter of the room. Maggie ignored the designated safe zones I had pointed out on the floor plan. She moved through the open concept living area with a predatory, restless rhythm. She touched everything. The mantle, the curtains, the empty bookshelves, claiming the space simply by existing in it. She wasn't fearful. A witness in a capital case should be trembling, or at least quiet. Maggie was neither. She was bored, and her boredom felt dangerous. I tried to focus on the affidavit in front of me, paragraph 4, subsection C, but the words were swimming. The air in the room had changed. It was no longer the sterile, recycled air of a government facility. It was thick, heavy with a scent that bypassed my intellectual defenses and went straight to the lizard brain. Sandalwood, deep and resinous, mixed with that sharp electric smell of the storm she'd brought inside. It was invasive. It clung to the back of my throat. Every time she passed behind my chair, the scent intensified, a silent reminder that my perimeter had been breached. "You're reading the deposition from the grand jury," she said. I didn't hear her approach. She was standing directly behind me, close enough that I could feel the radiant heat of her body against the back of my blazer. I stiffened, my hand freezing over the legal pad. "I am reviewing the record," I corrected, keeping my eyes on the paper. "Consistency is key for the cross-examination. Consistency is for people who tell the truth once," she murmured, leaning over my shoulder. Her hair brushed against my ear, a shocking, tactile intrusion. "I've told that story 5 times, Luciana. It changes every time because I remember different shadows." I turned my chair, putting distance between us. "That's not how the law works, Maggie. The law requires a single, immutable set of facts. If you waver on the stand, the defense will flay you." She laughed, a low, dry sound that lacked any humor. She walked around the table and sat on the edge of it, disregarding the chair, disregarding the sanctity of my workspace. She looked down at me, her expression unreadable. "The law is a map," she said. "It's not the territory. You think because you have it written down in 12-point font, it's real? The things I saw, the things I did, they don't fit in your folders." "My job is to make them fit," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. "My job is to ensure that when you speak, it becomes admissible evidence. Truth is irrelevant if it gets stricken from the record." "And that's why you're terrified," she countered softly. "Because you know the truth is messy. It spills. It stains." She reached out and tapped the file in front of me. Her fingernail made a sharp click against the paper. "You're trying to contain an explosion in a filing cabinet." I looked at her hand. Long fingers, no jewelry, skin that looked impossibly soft against the harsh fluorescent light of the dining room. I wanted to tell her to get off the table. I wanted to cite protocol, but the words died in my throat. She was right. The friction between us wasn't just personality. It was fundamental. I believed in the system, in the clean lines of justice. Maggie was the chaos the system was built to repress. She was the raw, uncomfortable reality that we tried to sanitize with Latin terms and court orders. The light in the room began to shift. The gray stormlight outside deepened into a bruised purple, then faded into black. The automatic timer on the living room lamp didn't trigger. The shadows stretched from the corners, swallowing the furniture, pulling the walls in tighter. The professional standoff was dissolving with the daylight. We weren't just a clerk and a witness anymore. We were 2 women trapped in a box, and the darkness was stripping away the titles we wore for protection. Night did not fall. It rose from the floorboards, filling the room with a dense, pressurized darkness. The windows, previously gray portals to the storm, transformed into obsidian mirrors. Every time I looked up from my files, I saw only the distorted reflection of the safe house, the beige walls, the empty chairs, and my own pale, anxious face staring back. The world outside had ceased to exist. There were no streetlights, no passing cars, no distant hum of the city. There was only the wind and the crushing knowledge that we were a coordinate on a map that didn't officially exist. Sleep was a theoretical concept. My bedroom was upstairs, the first door on the left, a mirror image of the room Maggie occupied down the hall. I lay on top of the covers, still fully dressed, my shoes placed with military precision by the bed. A Supreme Court clerk does not sleep on the job, especially not when the job involves the most volatile witness in federal custody. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the shadows of the rain slicking down the skylight. My mind was a hamster wheel of statutes and potential cross-examination questions. But beneath the legal noise, I was listening. A house this empty has a vocabulary. The thermal expansion of the wood sounded like pistol shots. The HVAC system groaned like a dying animal. But I wasn't listening for the house. I was listening for her. I heard the floorboards creak in the hallway, a slow, deliberate pacing that mirrored the rhythm of the rain. She wasn't sleeping either. The sound was maddening. It was a physical tether connecting my insomnia to hers. After an hour of staring at the plaster, the silence became too loud to bear. I swung my legs off the bed, grabbed my phone, and moved into the hallway. I didn't turn on the lights. Protocol dictated keeping a low profile, but instinct told me the darkness was safer. I moved down the stairs, guided by the faint, ghostly illumination of the security keypad near the door. The kitchen was a cavern of shadows, stripped of warmth. But it wasn't empty. Maggie was sitting on the counter, her legs dangling, a silhouette cut from the dark. The storm clouds had thinned just enough to let a sliver of moonlight bleed through the high windows, washing her in a cold silver grain. She wasn't wearing the silk blouse anymore. She was in a simple, oversized t-shirt that looked borrowed, her hair pulled back in a loose, messy knot. It was a domestic image, startling in its normalcy, yet terrifying in its intimacy. She looked younger. She looked breakable. I stopped in the doorway, my hand hovering near the light switch before dropping to my side. To illuminate this moment felt like a violation. She didn't startle. She didn't even look up from the glass she was holding. "The plumbing in this place screams," she said softly. "I thought you were a pipe." I couldn't sleep, I admitted, stepping into the room. The air here was cooler, smelling of rain and the amber liquid in her glass. "Guilt keeps you awake," she mused, swirling the contents. The ice clinked, a sharp, musical sound in the dead quiet. Or is it fear? With you, Luciana, it's hard to tell where the lawyer ends and the nervous breakdown begins. "It's vigilance," I corrected, leaning against the doorframe, keeping the distance of the room between us. "And I don't have a nervous breakdown. I have a docket." She chuckled, a low vibration that I felt in the floorboards. She lifted the bottle of bourbon she'd found, God knows where, probably hidden by a previous handler, and held it out toward me. The amber liquid caught the moonlight, glowing like a trapped ember. "Drink," she commanded gently. "You're vibrating." "I can't," I said. The refusal was automatic, a reflex honed by years of discipline. "I'm on duty. Federal regulations prohibit the consumption of intoxicants while securing a witness." "Federal regulations," she repeated, tasting the words like they were sour wine. "We are two women, locked in a box in the middle of a hurricane. The government isn't watching, Luciana. The cameras don't see in the dark. The satellites are blind." She took a sip, her throat moving as she swallowed. "Right now, you aren't a clerk. I'm not a witness. We're just the only two people left on Earth." I watched her, the bottle still extended. My no hung in the air, flimsy and bureaucratic. The strict architecture of my world felt very far away. Here, in the blue-black dark, the only law was the proximity of her body and the terrifying reality that for the next few hours, we were erased from the record. Day 2 arrived with a bruised, gray light that offered no clarity. The polite distance we had maintained, the carefully constructed DMZ between the dining table and the living room, was slowly eroding. It wasn't a sudden collapse, but a weathering, like limestone under acid rain. The air in the house felt thinner, heavily charged with the static of two people pretending they weren't hyper-aware of each other's breathing. I tried to bury myself in the evidentiary files, but the text swam. Every time Maggie moved, every time silk rustled against upholstery, my focus fractured. Then, the world shattered. It wasn't a knock. It was a violent, tearing crash from the rear of the house, followed by a heavy thud that shook the floorboards. It sounded like a breach. It sounded like the end of the trial. I didn't think. The part of my brain that synthesized legal arguments shut down, replaced instantly by a primal reptilian imperative. Security protocol dictated a retreat to the safe room, but instinct is faster than a manual. Maggie was standing near the hallway, freezing in the center of the open space. I moved. I crossed the room in 2 strides, abandoning the files, the laptop, the law. I reached her and didn't stop. I drove her back into the shadows of the alcove, my hands gripping her shoulders, my momentum carrying us both until her back hit the drywall with a sharp exhale. I didn't just shield her, I covered her. I pressed my body solely against hers, pinning her to the architecture of the house, using myself as the only barrier between the witness and the threat. "Stay down," I whispered, the command harsh and breathless. We froze there, a tangle of limbs in the dim hallway. The house went silent, waiting for the second shoe to drop, waiting for the footsteps. But there was nothing, just the wind screaming against the eaves and the frantic staccato rhythm of our own hearts. And then the nature of the silence changed. The threat hadn't materialized. Through the high window, the gray shape of a massive oak limb slid slowly down the roofline, scraping against the gutters before crashing onto the deck. A branch. Just gravity and old rot. The assassin was a tree. I knew it was over. My brain registered the all clear, but I didn't move. I should have stepped back immediately. I should have apologized for the force, for the invasion of her personal space. But my feet felt nailed to the floor. The adrenaline that had surged to fight a gunman was now trapped in my veins with nowhere to go, transmuting rapidly into something heavier, darker. I was pressed along the entire length of her. I could feel the heat of her skin burning through the thin fabric of her shirt, a radiant warmth that seemed to seep into my own cold blood. I could feel the rapid, fluttery beat of her pulse against my chest, syncing with mine in a terrifying, syncopated rhythm. The proximity was intoxicating. It was a sensory overload. The deep smell of her hair, the rise and fall of her breath, the solid, undeniable reality of her body beneath mine. The intention of the hold shifted. My hands, which had gripped her to save her, were now gripping her to keep her. The texture of intention dissolved, shifting from protection to something far more volatile. I looked down. Maggie wasn't looking at the window. She wasn't looking for the danger. She was looking up at me, her head tilted back against the wall, her eyes wide and dark. She wasn't afraid. She was studying me. She was reading the tension in my jaw, the flush on my neck, the hesitation in my release. She felt the change in the air, the moment the guard became something else entirely. I pulled away. It was a physical wrenching, like tearing a magnet from steel. I stumbled back a step, putting a foot of cold, empty air between us. I smoothed my blazer with hands that wouldn't stop trembling, desperate to rebuild the wall I had just demolished. "It was a branch," I said. My voice was wrecked, stripped of its judicial calm. Just a branch. Maggie didn't fix her shirt. She didn't move from the wall. She just stood there, in the shadows, watching me with a new, dangerous curiosity, realizing that the biggest threat in the house might actually be me. The hallway incident left a thick residue, a static charge that clung to the furniture, the neutral walls, and the charged space between us. I tried to retreat to the dining table, to the safety of my red-welled folders and the comforting, dry language of the appellate court. But the words were just ink now. They had lost their power to shield me. Every time I looked up, I expected to see the assassin, but instead, I saw the ghost of that embrace, the memory of her body pressed against mine, burning like a phantom limb. Maggie didn't let the silence settle. She didn't retreat to her room or her boredom. She circled back to the table, but this time, she didn't sit on it. She pulled out the chair opposite me, the wood scraping loudly against the floor, a deliberate opening statement. "You're shaking," she observed. It wasn't an accusation. It was a data point. "Adrenaline dump," I lied, not looking up from emotion to suppress. "It's a physiological reaction to a threat assessment." "You wear that suit like chainmail," she said, leaning forward. Her voice dropped, losing its mockery. "But I felt your heart against my back in the hallway. That wasn't a statute. That was a woman, terrified of what she wanted. The accusation hung in the air. She wasn't asking about the night of the murder. She was interrogating my existence. I don't want to burn, I admitted, the truth slipping out before I could redact it. I want to endure. Endurance is just suffering with a better PR team, she smiled, a sad, knowing expression. Real truth isn't found in your books, Luciana. It's found in the things you're afraid to touch. Before I could respond, a sharp electronic whine cut through the room. The laptop screen flickered, the green connection bar turned red, and then black. The satellite link was dead. The storm had severed the digital umbilical cord connecting me to the court. I stared at the dark screen. The silence that followed was absolute. No hum of the drive, no connection to the grid. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees in a second. The HVAC system sputtered and died. The backup generator kicked in with a distant, heavy rumble, but the main heat was gone. We're alone, Maggie said. It wasn't a question. The secure line is down, I confirmed, my voice trembling. We have to conserve heat. We need to move to the fireplace. The perimeter of our world, which had been the house, then the hallway, had just shrunk again. Now it was just the wool rug in front of the hearth. I stood up, gathering the files uselessly, feeling the walls closing in. The trial of the decade was happening in D.C., but the verdict was being decided right here, in the dark, between a woman who knew too much and a woman who was just starting to learn. The generator kept the perimeter alarms alive, but abandoned the comfort systems. The overhead lights flickered, buzzed like a dying insect, and then gave up. The house didn't just go dark. It went gray, a heavy, suffocating slate color that leached the warmth out of the walls. The temperature began to plummet immediately, the storm outside reclaiming the climate inside. We were forced to migrate. The dining table was an island of ice now. The only viable territory left was the hearth. I knelt on the rug, my knees sinking into the wool. I was trying to construct a fire with the same rigid methodology I applied to a legal brief. Kindling at the base, logs arranged in a precise pyramid structure to maximize airflow. I was building a defense against the cold. Maggie didn't sit on the sofa. She slid down to the floor beside me, dismantling the distance I was trying to maintain. She was too close. In the gray light, her presence was a source of gravity pulling at my orbit. "You're building a monument," she whispered, watching my hands arrange the wood. "Just light the damn thing, Luciana. It needs to catch properly," I murmured, my voice tight. "If you smother the base, it smokes." "You're afraid of the smoke," she countered. "You're afraid of anything you can't control." She reached out. Her hand moved into my field of vision, pale and steady. She took the box of long stem matches from my grip. It wasn't a snatch. It was a transfer of command. She struck the match against the side of the box. The sound was a sharp, violent scratch in the silence, followed by the hiss of ignition. The flame flared to life, a sudden tear-shaped hole in the darkness. The smell of sulfur bloomed, sharp and acrid. She held the flame out, but she didn't touch it to the wood yet. She held it between us, a tiny, wavering sun. "Look at it," she said. I looked. But I wasn't looking at the fire. I was looking at her hand holding it. The way the light caught the tendons in her wrist, the way the shadows danced in the hollow of her throat. We were huddled over that single point of light, our faces inches apart, breathing the same rarefied air. She moved the match toward the kindling, but her hand brushed mine. It was an accident. Or maybe it wasn't. Her knuckles grazed the back of my hand, and the contact was electric. It wasn't a spark, it was a shock that stopped my breath in my lungs. My entire nervous system zeroed in on that square inch of skin. The cold room vanished, the storm vanished. There was only the heat of the flame and the heat of her. I looked up, and she was already looking at me. In the sudden flare of the kindling catching, her eyes were illuminated. I saw the specific, jagged grain of her iris, flecks of gold and amber suspended in the dark, a galaxy of trauma and defiance. I saw the dilation of her pupils. I saw the question hanging there, terrifying and raw. She leaned in, just an inch. A microscopic shift in the atmosphere. The invitation was absolute. It was a plea and a dare. All I had to do was lean forward. All I had to do was close the gap and the case would be over. The clerk would be gone. The witness would be gone. We would just be two women burning in the dark. I could feel the ghost of the kiss before it happened. The pressure, the texture, the ruin. But then I heard it. The phantom echo of the gavel. The weight of the badge clipped to my belt. The heavy, suffocating blanket of the law that I had wrapped myself in for a decade. If I crossed this line, there was no appeal. There was no going back to the record. I flinched. It was a violent, jerking motion. I pulled my hand back, as if the fire had actually burned me. I scrambled backward on the rug, retreating into the shadows, putting the safe, cold distance of duty between us. "The flue is open," I choked out. My voice was a stranger's, high, thin, pathetic. It should draw now. Maggie didn't move. She held her position, her hand still suspended where mine had been. She watched me retreat with an expression that cut deeper than any knife. It wasn't anger. It was disappointment. It was the look of a witness who realizes the judge is corrupt. She blew out the match. The darkness rushed back in, heavier than before. The fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows against the wall, but the warmth didn't reach me. I sat there, shivering in my tailored suit, listening to the silence I had created. It was loud. It was filled with the ghost of what almost happened, a verdict I had refused to deliver. "You're a coward, Luciana," she whispered to the fire. And she was right. I was safe, ethical, and completely alone. The embers in the hearth had faded to a dull, pulsing crimson, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floorboards. It was the final night. The realization hung in the air like the humidity, heavy and suffocating. We were sitting in the wreckage of the moment that almost happened, separated by 3 feet of wool rug and a chasm of professional ethics. The silence was no longer a truce. It was a countdown. Outside, the storm had settled into a monotonous, weeping rhythm, but inside, the pressure was building behind my eyes. I was rehearsing my closing arguments, not for the court, but for myself, trying to justify why I had pulled away, why I had chosen the cold comfort of the law over the terrifying heat of her skin. Then, the silence was murdered. The satellite unit on the dining table, dead for 6 hours, suddenly shrieked, a piercing digital trill that sounded like a flatline. The red connection bar flickered and turned a solid, sickly green. The world had found us. I scrambled up, my knees cracking, and grabbed the handset. The plastic felt cold, alien. "Clerk," the voice on the other end was stripped of all humanity, compressed by encryption into a metallic rasp. It was Marshall Vance. "Status check." "Secure," I answered, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet house. "Subject is contained." "Change of plan," Vance barked. "Intel suggests a leak in the transport route. Threat level is critical. We are moving the extraction to 0500. Be ready. If she steps outside that door before we arrive, she's dead. Do you copy?" "I copy," I whispered. The line went dead. The green light vanished. The lifeline became a paperweight again. I stood there, gripping the table, the words echoing in my skull. She's dead. It wasn't a hypothetical anymore. It wasn't a case file. I looked across the room. Maggie hadn't moved. She was watching me, her arms wrapped around her knees, looking small against the vast, dark backdrop of the safe house. The Star Witness. The title felt like a target painted on her back. I realized with a sickening jolt that the architecture of the law I worshipped couldn't stop a bullet. The precedents, the statutes, the procedures, they were paper shields. I was guarding a woman who might not survive the sunrise, and I had spent the last 40 hours reciting the rule book while she was trying to live. The professional distance I had fought so hard to maintain collapsed. It didn't crumble. It evaporated. The clerk died in that moment, leaving only the woman who was terrified of losing the person breathing across the room. "They're coming early," Maggie said. Her voice was steady, cutting through my internal panic. She stood up, unfolding herself from the floor. That was the death sentence, wasn't it? "It was a schedule change," I lied, but the tremor in my hands betrayed me. "Don't," she snapped, crossing the room. She stopped just outside my personal space, close enough that I could smell the smoke and sandalwood again. "Don't lawyer me, Luciana. Not tonight. You looked at me just now like I was already a corpse." "I am trying to keep you alive," I said, my voice breaking. "By treating me like evidence?" She took a step closer. You pulled away from the fire. You pulled away from me. Why? Because you're afraid of the marshal? Or because you're afraid that if you touch me, you'll realize I'm real? But I'm not just a case number you can file away when this is over. Because I have rules, I shouted. The outburst shocked us both. It rang off the empty walls. I have a duty. If I cross that line, I am no good to you. Your duty is to the court, she whispered, her eyes searching mine, dismantling my defenses with surgical precision. But what about your verdict on us? You felt it, by the fire. You felt the truth. I looked at her. I saw the fear she masked with anger. I saw the desperate need to be seen, not as a witness, but as a woman, before the machine swallowed her whole. The rules felt flimsy, ridiculous things. The rules are failing me, I confessed. The admission hung there, heavy and irrevocable. It felt like a surrender. I can't hide behind them anymore. They don't cover this. Then don't, she breathed. The distance between us was no longer a safety margin. It was a vacuum waiting to be filled. The air thickened, heavy with the terrifying, beautiful inevitability of the breach. The tension in the room didn't just snap, it disintegrated. The rigid geometry of the safe house, the straight lines of the walls, the rectangular shadows, the vertical integrity of my own spine, warped under the crushing pressure of the silence. It was no longer a question of if the dam would break. The water was already over the wall. We were just waiting for the drowning. Maggie stood there, her chest rising and falling in a rapid, shallow rhythm that matched the frantic, staccato tempo of my own pulse. She wasn't moving forward. She was waiting for me. She was giving me the choice, the terrifying agency to destroy my career or destroy myself. Looking at her, bathed in the dying red light of the embers, I realized there was no choice. The law was a cold, dead thing, written on cold, dry paper. She was alive. She was burning. And in 4 hours, she might not be. I crossed the room. I didn't walk like a clerk. I didn't check my perimeter. I moved with a singular, devastating purpose that felt entirely foreign to my body. I closed the distance between us, stepping into the blast radius of her heat. I didn't stop until the toes of my shoes touched hers, until the air between us was so thin it couldn't support a lie. I reached out. My hands, usually so steady when handling evidence, were trembling violently as they found the line of her jaw. Her skin was fever hot, a stark contrast to the chill of the room. She leaned into the touch instantly, a surrender that felt like a collision. Her eyes fluttered shut, and a sound escaped her throat, a low, broken exhale that shattered the last of my restraint. I kissed her. It wasn't a tentative exploration. It wasn't the polite, cinematic kiss of a romance novel. It was a breach. It was a desperate, starving thing. It had the weight of a gavel strike, final and absolute. The sensation was overwhelming. The taste of bourbon and fear, the crushing reality of her mouth moving against mine. It wasn't mechanics. It was gravity. It was the feeling of falling from a great height and finally hitting the ground. In that moment, the Constitution stuttered into silence. The Supreme Court, the statutes, the endless rows of leather-bound reporters, they all dissolved into gray static. The only law that mattered, the only truth that held any jurisdiction, was the pressure of Maggie's body pressing against mine. The only precedent was the way her hands tangled in my hair, gripping with a force that bordered on pain, anchoring me to the earth. It was a collision of fear and desire, two opposing forces meeting in the dark and detonating. I pulled her closer, my arm wrapping around her waist, crushing the silk of her blouse, desperate to eliminate even the concept of space between us. It was a protective gesture, turned inside out. I wasn't shielding her from a bullet. I was shielding us from the inevitable morning. Her hands gripped my shoulders with the precise force of survival, as if I were the only solid thing in a world that was rapidly dissolving. The kiss deepened, becoming a conversation spoken in the language of panic and relief. It was slow burn, a heavy, molten heat that spread from my chest to my fingertips, thawing the ice I had carried for years. I could feel the texture of her desperation, the way her breath hitched, the way her nails dug into the nape of my neck. It was the relief of contact after days of sensory deprivation. It was the feeling of finally telling the truth. We stumbled back, not parting, just moving as a single, tangled entity until we hit the edge of the sofa. We collapsed onto it, a tangle of limbs and shadows. The boundaries of clerk and witness were gone. There was no badge, no testimony. There was just the friction of skin, the scent of sandalwood overwhelming my senses, and the terrifying knowledge that this was the only safe house that had ever existed. We stayed there, entangled in the dark, letting the shadows swallow us whole. The storm outside hammered against the glass, but it felt distant, irrelevant now. I traced the line of her spine through the silk, memorizing the architecture of her body, because I knew the record would be sealed by morning. We breathed each other's air, hoarding the intimacy like stolen goods, while the clock on the wall ticked relentlessly toward the dawn that would tear us apart. Morning arrived with brutal efficiency. It wasn't a sunrise. It was a restoration of the grid. The gray light of dawn filtered through the blinds, bleaching the shadows where we had hidden, bringing the world back with a surgical, unforgiving clarity. At 4:55, the sound of the convoy approaching on the gravel driveway cut through the silence of the house, tires crushing stone. It was the sound of the clock running out. We did not speak of the night. There were no whispered promises, no frantic attempts to define what had happened on the rug. The silence was a pact, sealed and classified. To acknowledge it would be to expose it to the light, and this thing we had built was too fragile for the sun. I watched Maggie in the reflection of the hallway mirror. She was reassembling herself. The vulnerability she had surrendered to me was being armored over, layer by layer. She buttoned the silk blouse that had been crushed between us. She smoothed her hair. She applied a mask of aristocratic indifference that was terrifyingly perfect. I had my own reconstruction to perform. I pulled on my blazer, the wool feeling stiff and foreign against skin that still felt sensitized, electric. I checked the files, ensuring the red-weld folders were aligned, using the bureaucracy to steady my hands. I straightened my spine into the rigid posture of a Supreme Court clerk. We stood in the foyer, the scene of our first meeting, looking like two strangers. But the air between us was still ionized, heavy with the static of what we weren't saying. "Time," I said. The word tasted like ash. She nodded. She didn't reach for me. She knew that if we touched now, in the cold light of day, the structure would collapse. She picked up her bag. We walked out into the damp chill. The marshals were waiting. Faceless men in sunglasses, standing by idling black SUVs. The exhaust plumed into the gray air, smelling of unburnt fuel and separation. It was a transfer of custody. I was handing over the evidence. The ride to the courthouse was a blur of motion, a silent procession through the wet streets. I sat in the front, she sat in the back. I watched her in the rearview mirror, a ghost in the glass. She was looking out the window, watching the city wake up. Watching the people who had slept in their own beds, oblivious to the fact that their orderly world was being held together by the chaos in the back seat. The Supreme Court rose out of the mist like a marble fortress. The steps were a cascade of white stone, a stairway to judgment. The press was already there, held back by barricades, a sea of cameras waiting for the star witness. The SUV stopped, the door opened, the noise of the city rushed in. Sirens, shouting, the mechanical hum of D.C. It was deafening after the silence of the safe house. This was it, the handoff. I got out, my heels clicking on the pavement, a sharp, official sound. I stood by the door as she emerged. The flashbulb started popping, a strobe light of public scrutiny. Maggie didn't flinch. She stood tall, the aristocrat of ruin, shielded by the expensive silk. But before she turned to the marshals, before she walked into the machinery that would chew her up and spit out a verdict, she looked at me. It wasn't a glance. It was a collision. Her eyes locked onto mine, ignoring the agents, the cameras, the noise. In that split second, the marble steps vanished. We were back on the rug. We were back in the dark. The look was unflinching, devastating. It acknowledged the heat, the fear, and the lie we were about to tell the world by pretending we were strangers. It was a goodbye that burned. Then she turned. The marshal swallowed her. A wall of dark suits closed around the silk. I was left standing on the marble steps, the wind whipping my coat, feeling the phantom pressure of her mouth still burning on my own. The texture of the witness was still on my skin, a brand that no amount of scrubbing would ever remove. The heavy bronze doors of the court swung shut, sealing the witness inside the chamber of judgment. The sound echoed like a gavel, final and hollow. I turned away, the noise of the rushing city flooding back into the vacuum she left behind. The law demands order, precise and written in ink, but I know now that survival is always chaotic. If you've ever found clarity in the eye of a storm, subscribe for more stories.